Someone bought the extended edition of the Lord of the Rings trilogy from Google back in 2022. Not rented, bought. And 4 years later, they're gone from the library. And apparently the movies just disappeared altogether. And when he contacted Google trying to figure out what the frick happened, Google support eventually told him that the trilogy had been removed from their catalog. Okay? That's beyond concerning, but when I saw this story, my reaction actually really wasn't one of surprise. It was more like, oh no, it's finally happening. Because this has already happened to me. Years ago, I bought a bunch of old seasons of British Top Gear through Amazon. You know, the good Top Gear with Clarkson, Hammond, and May. Obviously, I have taste, okay? And I actually own, or apparently I should put enormous air quotes around the word own, pretty much every digital season of that show that Amazon made available. And then one day, some of them started disappearing. And I think it was around seasons 5, 6, 7, you know, some of the older stuff. And I paid for them. They were in my library, and then suddenly they weren't anymore. As I understood it at the time, the licensing had changed and Amazon no longer had the rights to those particular seasons. And I remember thinking, wait, what the frick? Did Amazon's current licensing rights have to do with something I already paid them for? Because if I buy a DVD from Amazon and Amazon later stops carrying the DVD, Amazon doesn't get to come to my house and take it back. My DVD does not give a crap about Amazon's licensing agreements, and I've been mildly paranoid about digital purchases ever since. But this Lord of the Rings story really bothers me because we're not talking about some obscure movie from 1973 that got caught in licensing hell. We're talking about a Lord of the freaking Rings, okay? One of the biggest, most successful, most culturally relevant movie franchises on the planet. And to be clear, losing some obscure thing you paid for would be every bit as crappy. But psychologically, I think most of us have been able to dismiss these stories because they always seem to happen around the kind of fringes or edges of the internet. Like a storefront nobody uses anymore shuts down, some weird licensing deal expires, an old game disappears, a publisher goes bankrupt, you know, and you think, yeah, that sucks, but surely the stuff I bought is fine, right? Surely Harry Potter isn't going anywhere. Lord of the Rings can disappear too. So that made me wonder, are these actually isolated edge cases anymore? And are we finally reaching the point where our digital libraries are old enough that they are starting to expire? So I started digging and this got considerably worse. Let's investigate. Right, so first things first, before we panic about the impending collapse of our digital libraries, we have to verify whether or not this actually happened, because the story went viral after Dexerto posted it on X Twitter, and I don't particularly enjoy building entire arguments around screenshots on Twitter, so I went looking for the original source, and it appears to have come from a Reddit post made on August 6th. So not that much better, but the poster says, I bought these in 2022, all of a sudden they aren't available, and there's no possibility of a refund or gift card. Hardly seems fair. And importantly, he posted more of the conversation from Google support. According to that conversation, clicking the purchase redirected him to YouTube, but the movie wouldn't play. Initially, Google support suggested contacting YouTube support, and he pushes back and basically says, yeah, but the reason it won't play appears to be that it's not in the library anymore. Eventually, according to the poster, Google support tells him that the Lord of the Rings extended edition, the only good edition, trilogy has been removed from Google's catalog. And because the transaction is from 2022, support says they can't access enough transaction information to refund him or offer a credit. So the underlying story appears to be real, but there is a really important caveat here. I have not found evidence that Google suddenly went through everybody's accounts and deleted Lord of the Rings. I haven't found thousands of people saying that they saw this and checked and their copies too disappeared. We have one customer, we have his screenshots, and we have a support representative apparently telling him that this particular trilogy was removed from Google. So those aren't entirely the same thing as Google deleted Lord of the Rings from everyone's library. It could be an account problem that Google support diagnosed incorrectly, or it could affect a bunch of customers and we just don't know yet. And Google's movie ecosystem has changed quite a bit over the years. Google originally launched movie rentals on Android back in 2001. Google Play Movies evolved into Google TV, and Google has repeatedly moved where and how customers can access their purchases. Google's own support documentation today still says you can find movies and TV shows you've rented or purchased in your library. So I don't think the responsible conclusion here is that Google has mass deleted Lord of the Rings. We just don't currently have evidence of that. I think it's probably possible, but we don't know. What we do apparently have someone who paid Google for a movie bundle 4 years ago and can no longer watch it, and then was told by Google support that it's just gone because that listing isn't in the catalog anymore, which made me wonder, how unusual is this actually in real life? Because if this is one bizarre Google screw up, that's annoying, but it's not exactly evidence that digital libraries are collapsing. So I did go looking for other cases, and yeah, about that. The first example is easy because again, it happened to me. Personal story here, I bought Top Gear, Amazon's rights changed, some of my purchase seasons disappeared, and Amazon's current terms actually explicitly contemplate this possibility. Amazon distinguishes between subscription content, rental content, and what it calls purchased digital content, which is purchased content according to Amazon. It's content purchased for viewing over an indefinite period of time. Now notice that word, indefinite. Not permanent, not forever, indefinite. And then Amazon even says purchased digital content will generally continue to be available for downloading or streaming, but may become unavailable due to content provider licensing restrictions or for other reasons. And Amazon says it isn't liable if that happens. So apparently what happened in my Top Gear collection isn't some bizarre accident. Amazon's terms explicitly anticipate that something you purchase may someday stop being available, which is great. But Amazon is far from the only company where this has happened. One of the most infamous examples is actually ancient by internet standards. In 2009, Amazon remotely deleted copies of George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm from customers' Kindles after discovering that the seller who uploaded those editions didn't actually have the rights to distribute them. Ultimately, Amazon did do the right thing. They refunded customers, but that didn't exactly make the fact that Amazon had remotely reached into people's Kindles and removed books they had purchased feel any less creepy. And yes, the fact that one of the books was literally 1984 is so absurdly on the nose that if you put it in a movie, I'd complain that the writers were just being lazy. Then we have games. Ubisoft shut down the servers for The Crew in 2024, and the game became unplayable. Ubisoft subsequently began revoking licenses from Ubisoft Connect libraries. That incident became one of the major catalysts behind the Stop Killing Games movement and eventually a consumer lawsuit in France. Now, I do want to make an important distinction here because the stories get matched together online constantly. A game being delisted is not the same thing as a purchase being revoked. If Steam stops selling a game tomorrow, but everybody who already bought it can still download and play it, that's not what we're talking about. A streaming service removing a movie from its subscription catalog is also not what we're talking about. You didn't buy that movie. Netflix taking Shrek off Netflix is annoying, but Netflix isn't taking your copy of Shrek away. What I'm interested in are cases where you paid specifically for the thing, it appeared in your digital library, and later you couldn't access it anymore. And there are enough examples of that to establish that the possibility is real. And then while researching this video, I found Sony. We've talked about Sony. That's where the story stopped feeling historical. Because on September 1st, 2026, as in a few weeks from the time of this recording, PlayStation customers in the UK are currently scheduled to lose access to 551 movies and TV titles they've previously purchased. Why? Licensing. Sony's agreement with Studio Canal is apparently expiring, and those titles are scheduled to disappear from customer libraries. And we're not talking about 551 pieces of forgotten straight to DVD garbage, which if you own digitally, you should still be able to own. But the affected catalog here reportedly includes movies like Terminator 2, Paddington 2, Pan's Labyrinth, even Rambo. These are recognizable movies, and this gets even worse when you remember that Sony stopped selling movies and TV shows through the PlayStation Store back in 2021. But at the time, customers were told that they would still be able to access the movies and television shows they had purchased, which sounds reasonable. And then the store closes, you can't buy new movies, but your old purchases stay in your library, except 5 years later, apparently some of them just don't. And this isn't Sony's first licensing rodeo either. A similar Studio Canal issue resulted in hundreds of purchased titles being removed from PlayStation libraries in Germany and Austria in 2022. Sony also announced in 2023 that previously purchased Discovery content would be removed because of licensing arrangements. That one has an important ending though, because it didn't actually end up happening. Sony eventually reached updated licensing arrangements and canceled the removal. And I think that's an incredibly important decision because it tells us two things. First, these licensing agreements genuinely can determine whether customers retain access to things they've already purchased. But second, these outcomes aren't necessarily inevitable. Sometimes the companies negotiate a new agreement and suddenly your ownership continues, which is a very strange form of ownership when you think about it. Your ability to watch a movie you paid for years ago can apparently depend on whether two corporations successfully renegotiate a contract today. And that is the part I just can't get past. Because why? Like, why should a licensing agreement that expires in 2026 undo a transaction I completed in 2022? And this is where, inevitably, somebody is furiously typing down in the comments, you don't own digital media, you bought a license. Yes, I know. You know, probably everybody watching this channel knows. Congratulations, we have solved digital licensing. Can we move past that now? Because I don't actually think that's the interesting question. The interesting question is how these products are sold to consumers. Let's take movies, for example. The storefront gives me two options, rent and buy. Now, those are two very different words. Rent means if I give you some money, I get temporary access to your thing. Buy means I give you more money and now I have said thing. Obviously, digital distribution complicates that. I'm not arguing that Warner Bros. Should email me a 70 gigabyte unencrypted MKV file every time I buy a movie. Although, I wouldn't complain. But when the storefront itself explicitly distinguishes between rent and buy, I don't think consumers are insane for believing the second option is supposed to be substantially more permanent than the first. Content is available for an indefinite period. And that's where the word games begin, because indefinite doesn't mean permanent. It means that there's just no predetermined end date yet. You can watch it tomorrow. You can probably watch it 10 years from now, unless something happens, and that something might be a licensing agreement you had absolutely nothing to do with, which creates this bizarre situation where I can pay substantially more money to buy something, and the long-term duration of my purchase is still dependent on a relationship between companies that I don't control. And apparently I'm not the only person who thinks the language around this is questionable, because California literally passed a law about it. Beginning in 2025, California restricted how sellers can use words like buy and purchase for certain digital goods unless consumers are clearly informed they're purchasing a license and that access may potentially be revoked. And here's the part I find interesting. The law distinguishes digital goods where access cannot be revoked after the transaction, including certain permanently downloadable goods. In other words, the permanence of the copy matters, which brings me back to the stupidly simple comparison sitting on my shelf, a DVD. So this Lord of the Rings guy bought it in 22.6. I'm not a mathematician, but I'm pretty sure 4 is less than 5. So what the frick happened here? Now, big caveat. His purchase originated through Google's movie ecosystem in 2022, and I'm looking at Google's current YouTube paid service terms in 2026. I've not established that this exact provision unquestionably governs this exact transaction. I'm not going to pretend I have. Terms change, services migrate, jurisdictions matter. There may be another agreement involved, but at minimum, Google's current published terms explicitly recognize that purchased content can disappear and explicitly promise a remedy when it happens within 5 years, which makes the support response in this case really weird, because even if we completely accept the argument that, well, technically he only bought a license, fine, for argument's sake, let's play by the licensing rules. Google's own rules appear to anticipate exactly this situation, and apparently the solution isn't necessarily, lol, I should have bought the Blu-ray, it's refund or replacement, which is what the customer was asking for in the first place. This made me rethink the question I started this video with. Maybe the problem isn't the company suddenly discovered that they can revoke digital purchases. They've been able to do that. Amazon's terms say it, Google's terms say it, Sony's licensing disputes demonstrates it. We've had examples going back nearly 20 years, so why does this suddenly feel like it's becoming more and more visible? And I think there's another possibility. Maybe our digital libraries are getting old, because digital media libraries aren't new anymore, and I think we forget that. Amazon launched its original digital video download service, Amazon Unbox, in 2006. 20 years ago. And I went back and looked at Amazon's original announcement, and the language is fascinating. Amazon talked about customers being able to buy movies and TV shows. It advertised digital download to own. You'd purchase a movie, download it to your computer, and even receive another copy optimized for compatible portable devices. The whole pitch was essentially all the benefits of owning media, but without the disc. Google entered cloud movie rentals in 2011 and eventually expanded into purchases. Apple helped normalize enormous digital media libraries. Kindle launched in 2007. Steam has existed since 2003. We've spent roughly 2 decades moving huge portions of our books, movies, television, games, and software into digital libraries. And 20 years ago, nobody could actually prove those libraries would last 20 years because 20 years hadn't happened yet. We were conducting an experiment, and now we're finally getting the results. Companies have merged, rights holders have changed, distribution agreements have expired, services have been discontinued, apps migrated, stores closed, authentication systems have changed, entire business models have changed, and our libraries have had to survive all of it. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And there are little warning signs all over the place. For example, for years, Movies Anywhere provided one interesting form of redundancy. You could connect participating digital retailers, and eligible movie purchases would appear across multiple services. So if you bought an eligible movie through Google Play, for example, it could also become available through other connected services. And that's actually a pretty good answer to one of the weaknesses for your digital libraries. So your collection isn't trapped in exactly one storefront, except Google Play and YouTube stopped participating in Movies Anywhere on October 31st of 2025. Previously synced eligible purchases remain acceptable, but new Google and YouTube purchases no longer sync into Movies Anywhere. Again, nobody necessarily lost their original purchase because of that. I do want to be very clear about that distinction. But one of the mechanisms that made a digital movie library more resilient became significantly less useful. Amazon did something similar in a completely different category. Until February of 2025, Kindle users had an official download and transfer via USB feature that allowed eligible Kindle content to be downloaded through Amazon's website and transferred manually to a Kindle. Amazon removed that feature. You can still read your Kindle purchases. You can still download them through supported Kindle devices and apps. So Amazon did not suddenly delete everyone's books, but another method of keeping a locally downloaded copy independent of media cloud delivery has disappeared. And I keep seeing versions of this, not necessarily that your library is gone, but the ecosystem changing, redundancies just disappear, the storefronts close, the licensing arrangement changes, local download option just goes away, and the service gets folded into another service. And every time that happens, your digital collection depends on one more corporate promise surviving the transition. Which is why I think the most interesting question isn't, do I legally own my digital movies? We've beaten that horse into paste. I think the real question is, can a digital media collection survive for a human lifetime? Because we genuinely don't know yet. We're only 20-ish years into this experience, and think about what a digital library actually is. Because when I look at my DVDs, that's my library. Those physical objects contain the media. If Amazon disappears tomorrow, my DVDs don't notice. If my internet goes down, my DVDs don't notice. And assuming I have a working player, I can put the disc in and watch it. And yes, physical media has its own problems. Discs get damaged or formats may become obsolete. Players can become harder to find. Like, nothing is literally permanent. However, I can make digital backups of my DVDs, but the important distinction is the continued existence of my copy does not require the continued permission of the store that sold it to me. A cloud-based digital library is different. What looks like a shelf full of movies is really a collection of database entries saying this account is currently authorized to access this content. And that authorization may depend on a lot of different things, like the retailer existing, your account existing, the authentication infrastructure, the DRM, and a retailer continuing to have whatever rights it needs, and potentially the rights holder continuing to honor the arrangements that made the transaction possible. That's a lot of dependencies, and I don't think we really thought about that when we started building these digital libraries, because digital purchases are incredibly convenient. I understand why we did it. Like, I did it. I have a giant digital library. I still buy digital media, granted a lot less now, or I have very special ways of making sure I have digital copies of my media. Thank you to Top Gear for teaching me that lesson. And yeah, I do like clicking a button and immediately watching something, and I don't like not having a wall of plastic cases, but it does make moving a lot easier. This isn't really technology bad type of video, but convenience and durability are two completely different properties, and we've spent 20 years optimizing digital media for convenience, and we're only now starting to get enough data to evaluate its durability. And that's why this Lord of the Rings story really bothers me, because I started researching this one because one guy said Google took away the Lord of the Rings trilogy he bought years ago. And I wanted to know, is this actually becoming a thing? The answer is sort of. I can't find evidence that digital purchases are suddenly disappearing en masse. I can't tell you that everyone's Google library is about to implode. I can't even tell you that everyone who bought this particular Lord of the Rings bundle lost it. Right now, that appears to be one documented customer case, and that's important, but I also can't dismiss that this is some ridiculous hypothetical anymore, because purchased digital media has disappeared before. It happened to my Top Gear collection. Amazon's own terms explicitly acknowledge that purchased video can become unavailable. So this isn't some loophole a Redditor discovered last Thursday. The systems were built knowing this could happen, and maybe that's the answer. Maybe digital libraries aren't suddenly expiring. Maybe they're just finally getting old, and Amazon started selling downloadable movies 20 years ago. And we're reaching the point where digital collections have existed long enough to survive or fail multiple generations of technology, corporate mergers, licensing deals, and platform changes. And we're starting to find out what indefinite actually means, which brings me back to my stupid seasons of Top Gear. Because after some of those seasons disappeared from Amazon, I started making sure I had physical copies of media I really cared about. And yes, I make digital backups of my DVDs too, because apparently I trust a hard drive in my house more than I trust a multinational corporation's licensing department. And honestly, I don't think that's irrational anymore. Not because Google is going to delete your entire movie collection tomorrow, probably not, but because when I buy something I care about, I increasingly want at least one copy whose continued existence does not require somebody else's permission. Most of my DVDs from 20 years ago still work. Some of the digital television series I bought years later don't. And now somebody who bought Lord of the Rings 4 years ago is apparently discovering the same problem. So maybe the question isn't whether digital purchases technically count as, because we already know the legal answer is complicated. Maybe the more important question is, are we comfortable building libraries that only survive as long as every company, server, and licensing agreement standing behind them does? Because for the first time, we are actually getting old enough to find out, and I'm not entirely sure I like that answer. So back up your purchases, guys. If you liked this video, go ahead and leave it a like. It genuinely does help the channel. If you think I got something wrong, or I missed a point, or something else that I should have considered, is there an example of a digital content that you lost access to? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe if this is your type of content. But fair warning, if you don't subscribe, I might be forced to banish you to the Shadow Realm.
Much better.
Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and peace out.